you can hit it. So if you can also just remember to use the mute button if you're not speaking. We've got some space at the end of the session for the director. If you're, if Ron, you've got some specific comments you'd like to make. I'm gonna just remind everybody that we moved to sort of a 2-minute rule. I think it helped. And I'd ask again that you try to keep your comments concise. Kay is online and we'll sort of raise a hand if we're going grossly over the time. And that'll help to ensure that everybody gets a chance to ask questions and we don't delay our public to beyond the end of the meeting. Couple of quick comments from my perspective. You know, this, where was I here? Had these. I just had a quick look at our terms of reference. So, you know, this study was intended to review a bunch of stuff, identify, engage with the community, clarify some things, define some things before, and here we get to the meat of what we're supposed to do. This is the project, before soliciting input from a study committee and the public to choose a final potential municipal boundary. So that's, you know, we're getting close to that now. Second point, that the committee would consider settlement patterns, i.e. zoning data, OCP data, ALR, population density, and that's all the data stuff that was compiled for us. Services and infrastructure, that's the fact sheets that were done for us at the start in a really detailed and thorough way. Tax revenue and tax revenue capacity, again, useful information. And lastly, community input, which in this project was going to be solicited through comments received on these sessions, the open houses that we did, the panel that we had with recently incorporated municipalities and the mayors or CAOs thereof, and this survey. So this survey really is one of several inputs to our ultimate decision. So then ultimately our decision is, and this will come next week, whether or not to recommend that an incorporation study proceed. And if we recommend yes, then on what boundary area would that incorporation study be conducted? So that's really what I wanted to just sort of capture before we got started here. Our consultants are going to walk us through the survey. I'm really ecstatic. We got over 500 responses, which, you know, I mean, it's not great. It's not like an election, but for a survey, it's actually quite reasonable for a survey. Want to remind us, it's not a statistical survey, but you know, we've got some good information there. I'm going to suggest that the consultants go through this. We try to confine any questions we have throughout the process to very quick points of clarification, and we save the discussion for after they've presented their whole thing so we can get the whole meal before we start dissecting stuff. So that's my request of you tonight. That's not, don't ask questions, just ask your clarification questions as we go and save the big detailed discussion for later. I think with that, I will turn it over to Alan and Sherry to walk us through the, oh, sorry, I forgot all about minutes, etc. Right on. Do we have the minutes of the previous meeting? Sorry, I'm just working on a small screen here and lost the agenda. So we've got the agenda. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda? Okay, I've got Kay. I'll take Kurt. Thank you very much, both of you. Any further discussion? Any amendments to the agenda before we move on? Seeing, hearing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor of adopting the agenda, raise your hand, please. Okay. Any opposed? Speak up. Not hearing any. That motion's carried. Media coverage. That was the first point, sorry. And before I turn it over to our consultants, it was brought to my attention that we wanted to have some comment on the media coverage. So the article that apparently caused some concern was circulated, or a link was circulated, together with my correspondence with the reporter to try to get something which seemed more appropriate. So floor is open for comment. Kay, you asked that this be put on the agenda. Perhaps you want to speak to it? If you're going to speak, you need to take yourself off mute. Nope. Nothing further to add? You'd think after all these years, you could figure out how to work the mute button. Okay, well, we're all stuck on mute.
No, it was, we were all stuck on mute and it said,
Okay.
the host won't let me off.
Okay.
I was asked to have this put on the agenda with respect to, in particular, the newspaper article and concern about how area E, fifth option 5 was reported in the paper. And so perhaps you could speak to that and the actions that you took once you identified there was an issue.
Okay. Well, I didn't really speak too much to any one of the 5 options. I just defined them when I was speaking with the reporter. I raised one concern with respect to McLean Creek, and to be quite frank, I wasn't expecting that the reporter was going to make any changes. So I raised the 2 issues with him the first time. He made one change regarding McLean Creek immediately and apologized. I heard subsequently that the option that I had actually identified with him as being more than a flippant, quickly add-on item, that it was more than that. It was a legitimate option. I heard subsequent that it was a concern to some of our members. So I went back to him and he acknowledged in our conversation, and that I actually wrote it back to him, that wording was quote unquote on him and he would own that. And he would make subsequent changes, which he did. So that's, if you look online now, the wording is pretty much verbatim what I gave to him in an email, and which I had taken out of the survey, I think. Yeah. So that's what happened there. Ron, question?
Oh, I think Ron's on mute there. He should be. Can everybody, can other get off mute? No, okay, excuse me here, 1 second. Let me just try to fix this. I beg your pardon. 1 second, please.
And
There we
thank
go.
you. Yeah, the
Thank you.
sign said host is not allowing.
Yeah,
meeting.
I beg your pardon on that. That was a glitch on my end.
Sure, sure. My question for Matt is, am I understanding you correctly that you're saying the reporter misunderstood what you said?
No,
I did speak to the reporter and I did ask him where it came from. So I'm just curious. I'm trying to understand what you're saying. Are you saying the reporter misunderstood you?
no, I'm saying that the reporter chose those words himself.
I don't quite follow.
Well, I didn't really speak in any detail about that, Ron, and about option E or option A, B, C, or D. He has got a certain amount of experience and knowledge of the community's efforts to incorporate.
Right.
And that was his assessment of option E. Okay.
I did speak to him and I did ask him where he got that idea from. And his answer was from you. Now, I know Joe and he's a competent, capable reporter. And so regardless of the misunderstanding that occurred, I did raise with Joe Fries the harm done. The words were harmful. To say that it was largely for discussion purposes, that's clearly not accurate. To say that option E would be problematic according to who and why? Provincial parks, well, Skaha Bluffs is in Penticton. I'd love to have it in Area D. It's unfortunate because the harm occurred and it represents the danger of I think what was said, I think, Mr. Chair, if you would agree with me, I think what was said was improper. And would you agree? What was reported as written by Joe Fries was improper.
Yeah, it was incorrect. It was improper.
Yeah, that's what I
Use
thought.
what words you'd like. I appreciated that he changed it.
Right, but the harm's done. It doesn't get, most people won't know that. And I spoke to him about it. It's worrisome because this is important and that kind of mistake does harm. That's my concern.
Okay. Point noted. Mylene, go ahead.
Can you clarify which publication and what date this was on? It hasn't
Was the
been said
Penticton-
which.
It was the Penticton Herald. And May 30th.
May 31 was the date.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make one very brief comment. I believe in one of the meetings I had said to tread carefully when talking with reporters, it would be best just to stay with a press release. Just a comment.
Other comments?
I was just gonna say, I also read the article and was a little bit discouraged by it just kind of painted the option E as something that wasn't really serious. We put it in there, but we're not really thinking that we're going to actually go that way. So it was a little troubling, but I'm glad to hear that it's been retracted. I don't know how many people read retractions, but you know what? All we can do is our best. So that's my comment.
Okay. Thank you. Any other comments? Okay, if that's received enough consideration, we'll move on. Now to the survey. Sherry and Alan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are, as you mentioned earlier in your comments, or as you at least alluded to, this evening's meeting is the first of two meetings in fairly rapid succession here, fairly close proximity to one another, on the matter of boundary, to address the matter of boundary, to come to a resolution of the matter of boundary for the committee. We're going to start our presentation by looking at the survey results. And I want to acknowledge, first of all, the work that my colleague Sherry has done on putting this together, bringing it together in such a short amount of time. So thank you, Sherry, for that. I think she's produced some really helpful information for the committee to look at this evening, and also then to kind of reflect on and then come back at our next meeting on the 21st. We want to then look forward to the next steps to take, and those are really kind of looking ahead to the next meeting, and at which we will have another look at survey. And so there'll be a little bit more assessment done on the survey, a little bit more kind of grouping for presentation purposes of the survey results. There'll also be an introduction of the draft report, and that draft report will is going to be a compilation of everything that the committee has produced or has had produced for the committee over the duration of the study process. It's not going to present much new information other than what the committee has seen and has discussed in public. There will, however, be a spot at the end of the report which will provide space for the committee's recommendation on boundary. And as you noted, Mr. Chair, there will be kind of a two-part recommendation. One will be on whether the committee wishes to recommend that there be a vote or that there be a process going forward on incorporation, to look at that in greater detail. And so another study to proceed with that. And the second will be then, if there is a desire to move forward towards a study on incorporation, to actually identify the proposed and the recommended, indeed, boundary study area boundary for that study. So that recommendation, and really to kind of help inform the discussion as part of this meeting, we're going to quickly touch base again with and have a quick look at the boundary considerations paper. And you've already kind of provided a nice introduction to that, Mr. Chair. And then David from the province is also going to provide some input from the ministry's perspective on boundary at that point. And that will then bring us to the end of our comments and slides for this evening. So let me share screen if I may. And I will ask Sherry to kick things off here with the first few slides on the actual survey and the responses.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. So as the chair noted, we received more than 500 responses, which is fantastic, actually. I know you mentioned that maybe it's not great. I don't think, and Christy can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I don't think the RDOS has ever received that many responses on a survey. And so I just threw up for comparison, because this is the only one that I knew the responses to, but the RDOS citizen survey that was done in 2020, just as a comparison, which is a sort of a annual, or maybe it's a biannual survey. Anyway, regular survey that the RDOS does received 223 responses, and that's a survey that goes to all of the RDOS. And then they've had another one that followed up in 2021 that received 373 online and 9 on paper. So just to give you a gauge that, I mean, those are surveys that were sent out to all of RDOS, or were welcome for all of RDOS to respond to. So this is really mostly just area D. And so to have 500 responses, I think is pretty great by all accounts. So moving on, what we provided you at this point is really just all the text answers, as you've noticed, because the package is so huge. So all the text answers provided to the committee to provide the full picture. We want you to have all of the answers, all of the information that was shared. I know it makes for a lot of reading, but it's really great that people have taken this much time to provide their feedback. And I know you guys over the course of this whole study have had a lot of reading to do, and maybe this is the most important reading that you have to do for this study. So other summary options, as Alan mentioned, can be provided. So we can provide this information in some other ways. We'll talk about that at the end, but this was the sort of most expedient way to get the information to you in the short amount of time from the closing date of the survey. So most of this information you already have in your package, but here's just some of the charts. I just want to make sure that we all know what they're representing. So this is the responses by area. You can see all the different areas that we provided. So this is basically people's answers to question 1. Oh, and I will just mention too, sorry, in your package, you have 506 surveys. There were 5 paper surveys that weren't entered into that. And I was working off the information that, so those were entered in on Monday. So I've updated some of these charts to reflect the 511, but the information that we give you after this will include those extra 5 surveys as well. So that's just the responses by area. Alan, if you can maybe go to the next slide. So this we provided, this is the question 3, the options where people stated their preferences. So this is people's first preferences by option. So that was included in your package. And this is, and I'll show you another slide that zooms in on a little bit. In your package, the same information is provided on a portrait as opposed to the landscape version, and doesn't have the numbers on it. But again, this was just breaking out those first preferences by area. So taking those first preferences and then showing what they were for each area. So it helps I think people, and Alan, if you can just go to the next slide. So one of the things you can do with this particular chart is you can see sort of, you can zoom in on areas and see what the relative or the proportional sort of responses were for each area. So, you know, you might notice in, say, Heritage Hills that 16 of them, or the biggest bar seems to be preferring no study, but then you can also see that, you know, if you combined the people who want the study, they've just got different preferences there. And so together these would be more than what you would see in the green bar. But it just helps you see proportionally what people in each area have identified as their first choice. The next slide. So this was just, again, starting to dig into the data a little bit, provide a few more for a little bit more of the story. So one of the things we did was look at what the second choice is. Of the 113 responses that we got who preferred, their first preference was that the study not proceed. So we just thought, well, let's take a quick look and see what their second choices might be. So that's what that chart shows. And then on the right here, we're showing the percentage of the first choices where people have identified either that they not proceed, the study not proceed, or that it proceed in an area that doesn't include them. So for instance, if you were in Vaso Lake and you chose that the study be somewhere else, like area A, or even option A or option B. So an option that doesn't include where you're from. So that's what this chart is showing. And along the bottom, we have just the proportion. So it doesn't work so well when you only have one person providing a survey from that area, but that's why we've included the numbers. So where it might be, say, more interesting is where if you look at, for instance, Skaha Estates. So they're more than 50% of those respondents from Skaha Estates indicated that their first preference would be for an option that doesn't include Skaha Estates. Now these charts that we provided for each option, so what they show is all of the rankings. So for option A, how many people ranked it as number 1? How many people ranked it as number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, and number 6? So the full range of all the rankings by area. So you can look and see at this, look at the chart and you can see how many people ranked it as number 1, for instance, and what area they're coming from. So you can see who's ranking that as number 1, who's ranking as number 2. And so the profiles are interesting in and of themselves, but then you can also compare them to other options. Because sometimes it's equally as interesting or informative to figure out who's ranked it as number 1 or how many people have ranked it as number 1, but also are people also ranking it as number 6? Is it last on people's list? And everything in between. So that's kind of what we've done with those charts. Alan, the next one. Again, that's option B. So again, each one has a slightly different profile that's kind of interesting to look at and figure out by area. Next slide. So I've done D, and then the next one, again, Alan. So I put these on the same page because they've both got the same count of the responses on the left-hand side. So it's just kind of interesting, again, to look at the difference in the profile. So option C, quite a few people ranked that as their third or fourth choice, whereas you look at option E and people either ranked it as number one or it's much further down the list. So it's a different profile that is presented. And then the last slide, Alan. Thank you. So the incorporation study should not proceed. So again, you have people who either this was their first choice, and if it wasn't, it was almost your last choice. So that's very little in between. So that's somewhere where people have very different views. They either think it's the best thing or they think it's the worst idea. So it just sort of reflective of people's views on those different options. And then the last chart that I included, this one actually is not in your package. I just did this one today, but we will provide all this information to you guys. This was looking at the preferences from properties that were outside all A, B, C, and D. So these are properties that were only included in option E. So this was basically question 5 on our survey. So there was 93 properties that identified through their location and through their answers that they were outside of A, B, C, and D. And then these are their preferences of those 93, whether they indicated that they were happy to be outside, whether they'd like to be included, or if they didn't answer and left it blank. So these are the ones that might help you. This chart might help people think about, where they would like those boundaries to be. If not, if they wanted to adjust some of the boundaries in their minds, these are the people who were outside of those 4 options. And so the one thing that we did want to mention is, so we can provide the data in some different ways and group in different ways. One of the things that we thought that we might suggest is providing it to you in area grouping. So rather than providing it, usually you don't provide on a survey the text answers in such small amounts. So you don't provide, say, one where there's only one response from there, because then it can identify that one respondent. So usually grouping them is sort of standard practice. But so we've suggested a few groupings here based more on our focus areas, just to make it a little easier when you're looking at where people are responding from, that so you don't have it broken down into whatever we had there, 15 different categories, and it makes it a little simpler. So that's what we're suggesting. But if someone has another grouping that they'd really like to see, we might be able to do that as well. And the other thing that we're suggesting is that we can also provide it to you by people's first preference. So whether their preference was option A, B, C, D, E, or not proceeding, we could group the results all by that. So we're happy to do those 2 options, or provide other analysis that the committee wants to identify that would be helpful for them. Alan, do you want to?
Sure. Thank you, Sherry.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Sherry. And as Sherry mentioned at the outset of her comments, what we've done this evening, because as it's only been 1 day since all of the results have been provided, is we wanted to quickly provide the full raw data, as it were, to the committee with some grouping. And we will now, as you will, go back and reflect on this and come back with some ideas on and with some different presentations of it. And we look forward to hearing from the committee a little bit later with questions just at the end of these slides in terms of the types of presentation and the groupings that would be most helpful to the committee, because these data really are presented to help the committee as it relates to this one particular factor, and that is community input, to help the committee really understand what the community sentiment is with respect to the different options to help inform the committee's recommendation on those options. Anyway, moving ahead, if we may, and thank you, Mr. Chair, we'll just kind of go through these last few slides here. We are, in terms of next steps going forward, so we do have a meeting on the 21st, and there'll be some more survey results summaries, as I noted. There'll also be the draft report, as I noted, and I already explained that draft report would be a compilation of the materials that have been before the committee thus far, plus a space for the recommendation. With respect to the recommendation on the next steps and the boundaries, so two-part recommendation, as you mentioned, Mr. Chair, earlier, one on whether to proceed with an incorporation study, and then two, if that is the case, to proceed with an incorporation study, or if that is the recommendation at least, a recommended boundary to be the study service area. And that boundary is going to be extremely important because it is a recommendation of a boundary for the study going forward, and it is a central part of this committee's mandate to come forward at the end of its job and provide a recommendation to the committee. And I just wonder, we just have a little bit of noise there in the background, so if you're not muted, maybe you could mute yourself until you're talking. We have discussed at length the process and the considerations that go into developing a recommended boundary. And there are several different technical factors. We've talked as a committee about those different factors. They are provided in the boundary considerations paper that was presented to the committee a little bit earlier. And really the idea of developing the boundary and of looking at the different factors, one of which is community input, but there are several others as well, is for the committee to be able to feel confident about putting forward a recommendation that is of a boundary that can work, that is viable should the community in the area wish to proceed with incorporation and ultimately wish to incorporate. So in other words, we want to, as a committee, position the community that is most interested in incorporation for success and put together a boundary that is most viable in that sense. The considerations paper, which we won't go through tonight, but just to refresh your memories on this, looked at the boundary and the need for a recommendation of a boundary in some detail. It kind of tackled four different questions. One was why is an incorporation study boundary needed? Two, how is that boundary established then? What are the considerations? Three, can a boundary change after it is established by this committee and as it is recommended going forward? In other words, can it change during an incorporation study? And then four, what are those factors and criteria that are looked at in setting a boundary? The factors and criteria, very briefly, not going into any detail on these this evening, but they do look at future growth and development. So where do we know from our OCP for the area? What do we know about from the regional growth strategy in terms of the areas that are going to have been identified by the community as areas for future growth and development? What are the property assessment classes? Because as we know from our earlier discussion, we want to have not only a robust property assessment base in terms of size, but we also want to ensure that there's diversity in that base. ALR, we want to minimize where we can the amount of ALR land within the area, and in particular where there is farm land that is class 9 farm within the ALR. We want to look at service areas as they relate to the utilities, water and sewer, but also where we can, fire is another service area. We want to look at potential infrastructure that may be needed, and do we have space to develop that infrastructure? The local road network is obviously of great importance. We've talked about that at several junctures during our discussions with the committee, because it is an expensive service and is one that a new municipality would become responsible for. Tax base, we talked about already. The parcel and the natural physical boundaries, very important because we've got in our area a lot of crown land. We've also got a lot of nature's reserve land or natural kind of set aside land, the nature trust and so forth. Those kinds of lands that have been set aside and are outside of any development area. So they don't add a tremendous amount to a municipality. And in fact, they can introduce challenges for municipalities. Population, we want to be very aware of population, not only the total amount, but different pockets of population. And then finally, community input, which we've talked about, and that, Mr. Chair, you talked about at the outset as being community input expressed through the open houses, through the meetings that have been held by the committee and the public questions that have arisen in those committee meetings, and then also through the survey. I will just note, I think that the importance when we look at the questions as to whether a boundary can be changed, once a study area is chosen, small changes can be made in an incorporation study. And so when we looked at, by way of example, the most recent one in Sorrento Blind Bay, a study area had been established, I beg your pardon, prior to the beginning or the commencement of that incorporation study. And that was very important because that allowed then the committee and its consultants to have an area within which to really focus the effort and collect all of the information and do all of the analysis, which is quite considerable. And to then be able to answer in fairly clear terms what the implications of a decision to incorporate would be to residents within that defined boundary in terms of service provision, in terms of governance, and also in terms of property taxes and cost of services. So can a boundary then be changed once it has been set and once an incorporation study is underway? Small changes can be made. In Sorrento Blind Bay, there were about 30 properties that were removed based on petitions that were brought forward to that committee. And so the province agreed after reviewing that those could be removed without triggering any major re-looking at the numbers, without any major reanalysis of the properties in the area within the study area. Significant changes, however, are much more difficult, and that's because, as we've talked about with the committee, when we do an incorporation study and we look at the properties within a particular boundary, a considerable amount of analysis is done on those properties, on the tax implications, on the servicing to those properties, and so forth. So taking a large area out of a boundary once it has already been set and once the analysis has been done really does trigger the need for a reanalysis, which in many ways can be almost the same as another study starting. So that's all leads to the importance of recommending a boundary that the committee will be content in retaining as it goes forward into incorporation, and will not necessarily be assuming that it can be changed in any major way once it's into the incorporation phase. Mr. Chair, I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to ask David from the province to give his perspective, because I know that the province has some perspectives, and obviously very important perspectives as they relate to boundaries.
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate that. Hello, everyone. Just a reminder, I'm David Van Nomen. I'm Senior Planning Analyst in the Governance and Structure Branch at the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, and I'm here as an advisor to the committee and a resource if asked for. So thanks, Alan. You've actually covered the provincial perspective in those factors and criteria in terms of what the province is looking for from the study, because the terms of reference and what the consultants were given were essentially drafted between the province and RDUS. So those considerations, all the future growth and development, property assessment class, ALR land, they're all very important. They're the technical criteria that are balanced with the community inputs. So the province recognizes that the committee has a hard decision ahead of them in order to balance out those two considerations, right? The technical criteria that the province is looking for, along with those community inputs, community desires in terms of what they would like to have a potential boundary be. So in the end, the committee, regardless of which boundary you choose, you'll have to rationalize and defend your recommendation against those technical criteria along with the community input. The biggest piece that I think that I really wanted to talk about today, again, and I've mentioned it a few times before, but I'll go into a bit more detail today. What I would really like to encourage the committee members to think about is to really minimize the amount of Crown land that is being considered into this potential municipal boundary. And that's really for three reasons. The first one was mentioned already before, where Crown land provides no taxable benefits. So in other words, no revenue coming from those lands. and sorry, this also is reinforced by Sherry's data that there's 20,000 hectares of Crown land included in option E. So that's really where I'm focusing on, that 20,000 hectares. So there's no revenue. Municipal bylaws have no authority on Crown land. So in other words, there'd be no local control over those lands unless there's a Crown grant or nominal rent tenure, and that changes the ownership for a set amount of time, potentially to municipality, but that would not be considered for 20,000 hectares. Those Crown grants are usually for municipality or much smaller scale for either, in one case, a golf course or sometimes parkland. But so there's that. And then the major one that I want to talk about is if this study goes to an incorporation study phase, the province is responsible to engage in consultation with Indigenous peoples in British Columbia. So regardless of what the boundary is, the province will be engaging in consultation with local Indigenous and First Nations that essentially raise a hand and say, well, we ask them if they have any concerns, and then a conversation ensues. Crown land is Crown land. It's not private land. So it is one of those pieces of land that is really open to conversation for First Nations that are interested in either treaty negotiations, which are not in the area, or accommodations for, oh, you're interested in something happening here. Well, we're interested in these lands. So again, that's a provincial consideration. However, the more Crown land is being included, the province will take that into consideration when it comes to a final decision. And then more specifically, what I wanted to mention was there's changing relationships between the province and Indigenous peoples in British Columbia. One indication of that is on Haida Gwaii. The Haida people in the province engaged in a report, and it's called the Changing Tides Report. And the long and short of it is, one of the considerations of that report is thinking about allowing or placing Aboriginal title on Crown land. So, and that's specifically for Haida Gwaii. However, because that's already out there, other Indigenous groups may realize that and bring that to the conversation. So that's just, again, the provincial perspective on that. Yeah, and I think that's the main thing that I wanted to say. And then in terms of the incorporation process and Alan's comments about boundary changes, he's correct where small changes may be possible. However, the committee will have to submit, again, a request and a rationale to the province for why they want those properties to be excluded. And in the end, it's a minister's decision. So it's not, there's some political thinking behind it. And so that's why for small changes, it might be possible, as Alan said, because the implications may or may not be so significant that the change could happen and the study could go forward as is. Yeah, all right, I'll leave it at that. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, David. Mr. Chair, I will stop the slides now and turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much to the consultants and to David. I don't want to put Christy on the spot, but we have heard from the consultants and the province. I'm just wondering if, Christy, you have any comments from the RDOS perspective writ large before we get into discussion?
Thanks, Chair. I think at this point, no, definitely it's certainly in the hands of the committee and the consultants. And I think a thorough job is being done. So we'll, the regional district, the board of directors will just wait to see the results of the report in the next while.
Okay, thank you. All right, then with that, I'll open the floor to questions, which I just think we're trying to, these are just interim results and it's our first look at them. Many of you've got experience in looking at data and raw results. So I think, this is a good opportunity to discuss what's the best way of slicing and dicing this to better inform our decision next week. So I see questions here from Phyllis, Kurt, and Ron. So we'll go in that order, and then as we get more questions, we'll keep going.
Okay, so my question, just clarification with what David said. He said that if I understand it correctly, that the Crown land at some point may be turned over to the Indigenous people, and so therefore it would not be a good idea to include that in our consideration for the boundary. Am I understanding that properly, or am I out to lunch?
Partly, Phyllis. Sorry, I don't mean to say that Crown land will be given at all. There's no guarantee of that. There's no guarantee that that conversation will even happen. In terms of, it really depends what concerns, if any, the First Nations in the area raise. I'm just saying that Crown land, in terms of the broader provincial discussions going on with Indigenous peoples, Crown land is the land available that the province could provide for accommodations or for any other agreements that are going forward, as compared to fee simple private land.
Okay, yeah, understanding that now. So yeah, it's not a given thing, but it's a possible thing. It's just kind of interesting in that, you know, I didn't see a single Aboriginal person at any of our community meetings or the panel discussion. So it's kind of something hard to kind of wrap your mind around.
It is, but I would not take a lack of participation in those open houses for a lack of interest in the incorporation conversation.
I think as well, we've no clue as to how many or who has looked at the online material. So, okay, Kurt.
Yeah, again, on the topic of Crown land, there's no tax revenue, no municipal governance. So, and there's really no obligation for us to put services up there. At such a time that Indigenous people would have interest in that, which I really don't think they're going to take a whole lot of interest in. It's a big rock. There's not a whole bunch of beachfront lake.
I'm sorry, Kurt, I would not make any assumptions on what Indigenous peoples do or do not want and what they're interested in. Thank you.
I respect your position, and I'm not making any assumptions. I'm making observations. It's a rock. The likelihood that it would be treated the same as Haida Gwaii, which is a beautiful natural reserve that they want to preserve as local history and heritage. And I don't discredit that from our local Indigenous people. A matter of fact, I come from a mixed family, and half of my family is local Indigenous people. And so from conversations that I've had with them, there may be conversations about land claims just to shorten the term up, but I don't think it really plays a big role in how we look at local governance. Just because my backyard bounds onto Crown land doesn't mean that I should be excluded from an incorporation. If we wanted to tidy things up, perhaps we would just reorganize the boundary to exclude the Crown land, because it really hasn't contributed to Area D in any significant way in the past 50 years, nor do we expect it to contribute to Area D in the future 50 years. And so to use this as a point of contention is a little pointless. Just reorganize.
It wasn't a point of contention, sorry. It was just raising the provincial perspective on what has to happen regardless of whatever boundary is chosen, that the duty to consult must be discharged, and it will happen. So that's all I just wanted to say about that, Kurt.
Yeah,
Okay,
and
we'll avoid the discussion between individuals. We'll just
I respect that position. All I'm saying is let's simplify it. Knock off the Crown land. Let's reorganize the boundary there. Get rid of the Crown land, that it's not even a part. It's no tax revenue to us, and we don't have any governance jurisdiction over it. Why should it come into the conversation? It's just sitting there. It's not serving a useful purpose to this discussion. And so perhaps part of the boundary discussion should be removing or limiting the Crown land from the boundaries studied. That's my point.
Okay, so could we eliminate Crown land from option E? Okay, I think at the moment we're just putting comments out for thought process. Is that right, Kurt? I
Yes.
don't know that there's an answer for this one right
No,
now.
no.
Yeah.
I'm raising a point. Like,
Yep.
rather than getting involved with a big discussion on the merits of Crown Land, why don't we eliminate them altogether so we don't have to waste our time on it?
Okay. All right. Ron.
Yes, and thank you to the chair, and thank you, Kurt and Phyllis for the questions and the comments. My comment and question is in the same area. And I wanted to just bring to the attention of David Van Omen specifically, and staff and consultant who were absent from meetings recently. This option E, as I understand it, and I sure don't mind being corrected by anybody on the committee, including the chair. My understanding is it was really about what the consultants refer to as the fringes and edges, the 30 properties on McLean Creek Road, the 18 titles across the water and the bridge, the 16 titles in Golden Hills, the 141 titles in Upper Carmi. And when the option E was recommended by the committee, supported by committee, there was a suggestion, because the idea was, it's everybody. And in that context of everybody, came back this first time to me news, first time I heard it ever, there's people in the Crown land. I didn't even know there were people or titles on the Crown. I had no clue. In fact, my impression of the committee is nobody knew that. So we got that information rather late in the process. I don't think the option E was really focusing on the Crown land as an objective at all. That wasn't the objective. So that information, I think, is real important, I think, for David and others to hear. But my question is for David, and it's the same question that that Kurt put forth, but I'm looking for an answer to my question, and that is, could choice E be limited so it excludes the Crown land? I think that simplifies the boundary, gets rid of all, and I see nodding of heads. It removes all the concerns David has introduced. David is from the province. I'd love to hear his input, and from the consultants as well, if they have something to contribute. But it seems to me that that is the solution that is being suggested by those concerns that David has raised. My question is, what does David think about that? And maybe that's a way to look forward.
Okay, to the province, do you have any comments on the question about excluding Crown land from option E?
No, that's a decision for the committee to make after saying my comments. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, other comments or questions? Mylene.
In Sherry's presentation, she had said that the raw data could be presented in another fashion. I think it would be very helpful to see by location the comments. I read through the 73 pages last night, and there's a lot in very extreme from one side to the extreme opposite. I would like to know, looking at option E, those that are outside of A, B, C, D, I'd like to know their location and what their comments were to have a better understanding of where the line could be moved a bit, a better understanding as residents in those areas that want to either be definitely in or definitely out. So I would like to see a little bit more deeper look into the raw data to have a better understanding to make a better decision. Thank you.
Okay. Sherry, Sherry or Ellen, is that a?
Yeah, that's and one of the groupings that we were suggesting. So you'd get that data in two ways. One of the groupings is all of those who aren't in A, B, C, or D. So you would get those grouped together. And I think the chart also that we added that isn't in your package today that shows all those that are out and whether they said that they wanted to be in or not, probably is helpful that way. But we will also, we were also suggesting that we do it by preference. So you would get all of those who said option E and what their comments were. So again, a little more focused. I think you still might find that they say a variety of different things, but yes, you'll have it grouped that way. So hopefully that's helpful.
A question from Mylene again.
Good.
Mylene? No, okay. All right, other comments or questions? Phyllis, go ahead.
I just want to say, I also read all the comments and I agree with Marlene that it's quite a broad spectrum from one side to the other. And I was really, I just wanted to say that it was interesting when comments are made about an area by people who don't live in that area. I was quite surprised how many people said Basso Lake isn't associated with OK Falls. It's associated with Oliver. But anybody that I talked to said, no, OK Falls is our center. So I think that's one of the things when we start doing our analysis is to be looking at the criteria, listening to each other, listening to the consultants, and definitely, taking consideration to all those comments. But, some people obviously put quite a bit of time and thought into it. Other people wrote some comments that really seemed very much off the cuff. And I guess it's up to us to surmise how much weight to put on some of those comments. That's all.
Okay. I'm just going to pass on a comment. I think you've already got it, but I would like to, this was received by me in conversation. How many people actually support the option that they live in? Okay, so. And I think I'd be interested in looking at the 3 areas we identified. Yeah, 4 actually, because I'd like to see Upper Carmi in this as well. But group the subcategories within that to show how do the people of Okanagan Falls and the area within that, and how do the people of Skaha Estates and Heritage Hills and the people of Vasa and the people of Upper Carmi. Kurt?
Hi, this question is for the province, and there's been some curiosity. So in the Crown Land, there's, I forget the exact number of individual parcels up to the east of Skaha Lake that we noticed. There's a group of 5 or 6, and then a couple other orphaned ones. I'd just like some history on those. What are they? Are they converted TFLs? Are they, were they mining claims that got converted into private property at some time? Is there, I'm just interested. Who owns, well, maybe not who owns those properties, but what's the history on them, and do they have an interest in this conversation? I don't know.
Okay. Okay, sounds like we'll get back to you on that one. Further comments or questions? Okay.
Just to add to what's been said, I think it's important that we are seeking clarification. For instance, I know the breakdown of, as you mentioned, the people, whether or not they want to be included in a boundary and break it down by way of area. And you mentioned Heritage Hills, but there's also Lakeshore Highlands. And if we can get those specifically broken down, I think that will help us to flush out where the people who have taken the time to complete the survey, what their thoughts are, and then try to marry up the myriad of comments with those areas, and because I too read them, and I did start seeing some trends emerging with regards to the comments, but it's hard to know because we don't know whether a person is living in that area, or the people who are responding, or they're living outside that area unless they self-identified that.
Sensing our, oh, go ahead.
So
Sherry.
I just want to make sure. So Kay, are you good with the groupings that we've suggested that we will provide the results by? So so you'll have those comments by area. Does that meet what you're looking for?
I think so. Won't know until we actually see it.
Yeah.
You know, you don't know what's missing until you go, oh, but certainly comments by area would be very helpful in us trying to sort through all of that data, because, you know, I have notes beside it, and I have highlights and arrows when people are saying, you know, it's too small, and
too big. Yeah.
And then too big, but we don't know
Yeah.
where people are living, where they reside. So I think that would be really helpful, Sherry.
Okay. Yeah. The only thing we have to caution about is like we won't break it down by the exact, like we can't give you when there's only one response from an area, we can't give you the one response. So you know what I mean? There is an assumption of some anonymity. I mean, people obviously put their own comments down, but yes, I think by grouping them, you'll know where they're from in sort of a larger area. And then we've grouped all the ones who would be, again, outside the ABCD. So that information hopefully is helpful in determining. Yeah.
So just from the feedback that I've received from Lakeshore Highlands, and it's going to be grouped in some other areas, and it may, you know, it certainly will apply to other places, that I just want to be sure that we're able to identify, for instance, like if Lakeshore Island is all in or all out, strong support or strong lack of support, that it's not getting herded in with some of the other areas on the north end, and you know, the other applies to other areas as well. So that's the challenge.
Yeah. And the data in terms of where your preference is, and well, you know, we've broken all those out by specific areas. It's just when we put the comments in, those are the things that can identify people, right? So that's when we need to group them on slightly larger, but yeah.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, just I'm sensing our committee, if I may be mistaken, I'm not trying to cut anybody off, but I'm not seeing a whole host of hands here. So I thought if nobody has any objection, I'd invite the public to ask any questions they might have, presuming that if they're on here, it's quite likely they may have looked at this. And I'm looking at some of the names, and I've seen many of them at some of our meetings. Any concerns with this from the committee? Okay, all right. So that said, Bob and Barb and
Sorry, Matt,
Kathy
to
and
interrupt.
Ellen Whitman.
Mylene has her hand up.
So, all right, Ron, you've got a question?
Oh, I just noticed Mylene had her hand up.
Oh, Mylene has her hand up. Sorry, I don't see Mylene anyway. So go ahead, Mylene.
I have to take myself off video to speak. Just comment back to Kay. Kay, the feedback that Sherry had said was that it would be East Side Road North. Are you fine with Lakeshore Highlands and Heritage Hills and Vintage Views and East Side Road North all together in one? I believe there's enough feedback and responses.
Yes, I think I'm okay with that until I have it in my hot little hand, and the other groupings as well. I mean, that's just the example that I gave, so that so that the comments, yeah, we'll get a better idea of the comments side. That's great.
And the only other thing I wanted to add to that whole discussion was those that chose option E, did they choose option E because they didn't fit in those other numbers? And that's where I wanted to have the comments. So I think from what you've said, Sherry, I think both Kay's questions and my questions would be answered with that. One final question. What kind of timeline do you think it would take to get that put together and out to us before Tuesday? Haha.
Well, I should be able to group it quite quickly. Yeah, I guess that's I'll have it done by the end of the week. Like it'll be Friday probably.
Just, it's been said many times, thanks for the effort to slice and dice this.
No
Yeah.
problem.
Okay, I will throw the floor open to Bob and Barb and Murray and Nancy, Alan, Karen, Stella, Beth, Brent. Anyone got any questions that you'd like to ask of the consultants relative to the data? And if so, please take yourself off mute.
Hi, Matt. I'm sitting with Judy here on my machine, and she's got a couple questions. If you have time to take those.
Yep, go ahead. That's what we're doing.
Okay, I have a few so I can stop and let other people ask questions. There were 41 responses from McLean Creek Road. Sherry, do you know how many people live on McLean Creek Road?
Nope, I don't.
No? Okay. And I'm just wondering, did you do anything to identify multiple responses? And how did you do that?
Yes, we did. So when people fill out the survey, they get an ID for the IP address that they're filling it out from. So we can see if there are repeats.
So if here, Brent and Sylvie both filled out a response.
Different devices.
But if a couple use the same device, then you eliminate one of those?
Nope. Nope.
No?
There were none that are eliminated. I mean, basically, we're just searching out for patterns. I mean, if you saw 15 from one or something like that,
Okay.
you'd start to know that something was up. But we knew that people would, in fact, I mean, we can turn it off so that people can only fill out one, but we knew that, you know, there's different people in a household that often share a computer, and that's okay.
Okay, that's okay. So, so a more substantive question, in the criteria, if the criteria really covered local road network. And so Vincent Lake, I believe, only adds something like 1.8 kilometers of a local road network. It's a very small road. But how is the distance between communities considered in your criteria? Or is it?
In a more general way, I mean, we added, I think, as one of the metrics in the table, we added what the local road network that you would be adding, because you're responsible after incorporation for the maintenance of that and the ownership of the local roads. And as far as the distance goes, it's more of a concern, I guess, for when you're sending your maintenance vehicles and then they don't do anything for, you know, whatever it is, 3 kilometers, or, you know, it's more distance traveled than time. But other than that, I mean, and I think we've referenced that in a few points in our boundary analysis, but yeah. So we've referenced it more as a qualitative note than any kind of quantitative measure.
Okay, and is that the same with any risks associated with East Side Road?
I'm not sure what you mean by risks.
That it is a road that may need significant upgrades. It's a road that may have landslides coming over it. It's a road that may be very expensive.
Right.
Does that come in anywhere?
Well, that kind of information comes at usually in the incorporation study phase, where the Ministry of Transportation is involved in doing a roads analysis in terms of the condition of all the roads that would be that the municipality or the incorporation study area would become responsible for. So they do that type of analysis. So we don't have that information right now. We did note the areas that are within the environmentally or the hazard zones that are identified within the OCP. So we did note some of those in the environmental criteria, but the condition of the roads was not one of our criteria.
Okay, thanks, Judy. Judy, I'm going to
Thank
let you come back. Judy, I'm going to let you come back, but I want to give everyone a chance here. So I see Kay has a question, and we'll come back to anyone else. And then Judy, you're more than welcome to ask further questions.
Oh, no, I was just being the timekeeper and mentioning that. Yeah,
Okay,
that's it.
okay. Well, I just want to make sure everyone else has got another opportunity to ask questions. And we'll happily go back to you, Judy, but I just want to make sure Colleen or Murray or Nancy's iPad or Bob and Barb don't have questions first. Phyllis, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, is Oliver Ranch Road considered part of highways, or is it actually RDOS road currently? Who maintains that road?
A portion of Oliver Ranch Road is considered a gazetted road, so it would be part of Ministry of Transportation and Highways. And then there's a portion that is not gazetted, so it's basically privately owned. It's part of the parcel. If it's not gazetted as a road, it's almost like a driveway.
Yeah, it's interesting because I had a concern with that in the past, and you know, RDOS told me to talk to Highways, and Highways told me, yeah, you know, we'll do it, we'll get to it, and nothing ever happened.
That might be why.
Right, thanks, Phyllis. Other questions?
Murray here, I have a question. The numbers that are coming up from different areas, let's say Upper Carmi, I don't know, you said 141 properties there, and there are people responding. I think I saw one chart showed like maybe had more than half the people there, or half the residences were responding. If you look at it, how do you compare that to the responses from, say, maybe Okanagan Falls? We had 300 or 400 from here out of a population base, you know. So, you know, one community or one of the areas that you're looking at could have over 50% of the people responding, another might be 10%, but more people. How do you weight that? Or, you know, I mean, one area with small population, a lot of people are involved, tossed up against a large number in the overall survey, kind of waters them down, yet they are very engaged in favor of whichever they're speaking for. How do you work that into the survey?
It's a great point, and I think that's why we don't just take the total number and say, well, this many people said this, and that's why we do break it out by area so that people can have a sense of, you know, this is where a lot of the responses came from, but that's a bigger community. And, you know, I think that we're trying to provide the information from the survey in as many different ways so that it makes sense to the committee and they can assess it and compare, you know, communities to communities, because they probably know their communities best, and so they have a better sense of that. But that's exactly the reason why we do need to break it out, so you don't just take the total and think, okay, you know, there's your answer. You need to understand sort of where those comments or where those preferences have come from, and that's what we've tried to do in how we sort of present the information so that people can understand all those different nuances.
So is that information there? I can see how many properties are in each of these areas and how many respondents, so as a percentage of.
We don't have the population of each specific area or the number of parcels in the total area. We did have population referenced in our community surveys. So in our open houses, our community open houses, which were just rough numbers because we don't have specific population broken out. We have a couple of areas where it's broken out by the census. So they provide an population for the Okanagan Falls area, but not for the other smaller areas. It's aggregated with others. So we don't have an exact number, but we do have some parcel numbers. So we can again bring that information forward to remind the committee of what some of those areas would be.
Okay, just before you carry on there, Murray, Kurt has a comment on your question. So Kurt.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's a metric that we can find and apply to it so we can see participation over regions. Just like Murray was saying, I mean, if 100% of people in one community got involved and only 2% in another community got involved, that weighs heavily on kind of what direction we should be looking at for individual communities. So I'm just wondering if there is a metric that we can get participation, our percentage of involvement. I don't know. I'm not a stats expert. I mean, I can read through them fairly efficiently, but I just don't know how I would gather that either. And I don't have the raw data in front of me. So is there a solution to that?
Sure.
Yeah, I think we could ask GIS department at RDOS. I know we've borrowed them several times. So maybe to give us a sense of the number of parcels in some areas to give us a better idea of that. It might not be the right, again, there's parcels is one number, population is another. So we might not have the right mix of those, but it'll give it a better indication.
Canada Post.
Well, that'll be the same as so houses. So yes, parcels, houses, those are numbers that we can probably have a sense of. And then, yeah, we could apply to like an average population from the area. So it'll give you an indication.
It's not going to be exact, but it gives you a measure.
Sure.
I think that's a start. Kurt, Murray, sound okay? Other questions? Murray, did you have another question?
No, that's good for now. Thanks.
Okay. Well, don't hold it too long because if you wait too long, the call will be over. So others, Nancy, Kathy, Colleen. Okay, Judy, did you have further questions? You're with Brent.
Okay.
Yeah, Matt, I had a question for David from the province, just in regards to the process, recommendations put forward to the province. Is there opportunity there to negotiate? Like we talked a lot about taking out Crown land and all of that, or is it work through the criteria, has to meet this criteria, and still the minister has a final decision on it? I'm just wondering about the process.
Yep. So the committee would, as Alan's mentioned at the start of the meeting, the committee would be recommending an incorporation study. And if they do, then they would also be recommending the boundary. And then that would go first to the RDOS board, who would then accept that final report. And they would be the ones to put forward the request to the province for the incorporation study with the recommended boundary. And then from there, the province would be examining the request. There might be some discussions back and forth, and then it would enter into basically the terms of reference piece, establishing what would go into the incorporation study itself. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, no, thanks. So there'll be a terms of reference and to kind of summarize it. And we work from that terms of reference.
That's right.
Yeah, thank you.
Have I got a question?
Oh, I guess Judy's got a question too.
So Sherry, in each of the options, there were some people that said they don't support incorporation at all. Of the total of the 511 responses, are you able to track using the IPL addresses how many people don't support incorporation at all? Like you can't tell whether it's the same people saying no to every option, or some people are saying no in one option but not in another. Can we get a sense of the 511 responses, how many just don't support an incorporation study at all?
Well, we can, we've used the indicator from the preferences. If people ranked the I prefer that no incorporation study proceeds as number one, we've used that as a proxy for not supporting incorporation or not wanting it. So I mean, that's one indicator you can use. I suppose you can, yeah, and there's people have used comments. I mean, honestly, people have, stated a variety of preferences, and even when they've chosen an option, they may then in their comments include something that says that they prefer that there not be incorporation. So there definitely are some mixed messages in there, but we've used that as the primary indicator. If people indicated that as their number one preference, that they wouldn't support an incorporation study.
So do we know what that number is?
Yep, we, just a second, I will call it back up and put my glasses on.
After you, Judy, after this response, I'm going to Bob.
113 people said that they prefer that no incorporation study proceed.
Okay, thanks, Sharon.
Yep.
Okay, Bob Shanks.
So my question is, I think, to David. David, once the RDOS requests a study, is it highly likely that the study would go forward, or I mean, how often is it rejected, I guess is my question.
Well, I can't say one way or another if it's highly likely or not. In the past, in terms of boundary studies that have, or rather governance and services studies that have evolved into boundary configuration studies, that's the platform for an incorporation study. It's rather uncommon, from looking at the experience, rather uncommon for an incorporation study not to proceed if the province agrees with the recommended boundary.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions, Bob? Okay, Alan, I see you looking like, are you trying to ask a question, Alan?
Sorry, are you
No,
asking
I was
me, Al?
actually talking to Alan Whitman.
I beg your pardon. Yeah.
Thank you, Matt. I made my points known fairly forcefully in the public meetings, and I'm not part of this committee, so I'll keep quiet now. I'm just listening. Just listening. Thank you very much. I did note that according to Sherry's figures, 59% of SCAHA states were opposed. I'm frankly surprised as low as 59%, but anyway, that was given. 46 responses, 27 against, 19 for, 59% opposed. If you'll keep that, and since you asked me, that's what we got. 46 responses, 27 against, 19 for, which is 59% opposed.
Okay.
But no, thanks for the offer, Matt, but I'm just sitting here listening.
That was a good comment for someone who was listening. Good job, Alan. Humor intended. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, I have one again.
Murray, go ahead.
I'm just confused. I'm going through the results. I'm trying to tabulate them. I know you've done yours too, but when I go through them and I see the different options, how many people said yes and how many people said no to them. So I think this relates to the question it was the person on Brent's screen there was asking too. Was it Judy? Was this to do with, how come I get so many responses? Like there's 1,300 people saying yes, we had 500 and some responses. So are they saying multiple times, yes, I like that one, yes, I like that one, and it confuses me. It doesn't seem like a very clear direction from people.
Sure.
I just want to clarify that if you're looking at the summary, so it follows the way the survey was presented. So question 2, every time we have answers for question 2, the first question, it would be 2A was presented option A, which would be option A was just Okanagan Falls. And then the first question, so 2AI, would be, are you located in this area? So there's a yes and a no. So if you're looking at the results, when we say yes, no, and blanks, those aren't yes, we want that. No, we don't. Those are yes, I'm in that area. No, I'm not in that area.
Okay,
And
I
then,
understand it. Yeah.
yeah. That said, interesting that you raised that point, because yeah, the more detail you go into, oftentimes that that first question, the yes no question, some people were clearly using that as a I like this or I don't like this, which sort of was easier to see when we looked at the preferences. So the data on that first question, are you located in this boundary? Not always correct, but yes, that's what we're reporting out on in that, just whether they answered yes or no. But that first question in every, under every option is just yes, I'm in this area, or no, I'm not. So that might be where there's some of the confusion is.
I haven't had time. Yeah, thank you. I see that now, and I was misinterpreting those numbers wrong to start with. Is there any feedback? I haven't had time to go through them. I just opened up the survey of the comments tonight. I felt some of the questions were confusing, hard to understand, and I had that comments from other people doing it. And if they're confused and not knowing which way to answer and how to answer this and unsure if they're answering it properly, it tends to create errors and maybe not giving you the answer that they wanted to. Did you get many responses along those lines that it was some of the questions were confusing, hard to answer?
There definitely are, and people can express that in different ways. They can express that also by not answering certain questions. So it's hard to know. I will say, like, an 8-page survey is a lot for anyone. This is super complex material. I think some people probably did a ton of homework and knew, did the research, have been following along, and others aren't going to. And I think that's always to be expected. But yes, I would say that the biggest question that we had, that I think that was probably is that yes, no, that I just mentioned to you, people not necessarily indicating that they are in or out. So that one, yes, not always done correctly, but I think the biggest takeaway, some of the biggest questions that we were looking for guidance on were people's preferences. So it's hard to say that people have done that one incorrectly. And then there's always the opportunity. I think one of the biggest things with this survey, often we wouldn't use so many questions with open-ended inviting comments. But I think that was sort of the key to making sure that people had the ability to explain why they were answering it something, or if they didn't know how to answer something, they still had a spot where they could say, hey, this is what I think. I may not get your questions, but I don't want to be part of an incorporation study, or I want in regardless of what the boundary is, so there was always the opportunity, I think, to find a way to say what they wanted to say, which I think is why it's important to read through all the 75 pages of comments.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. It just that was one of the major ones, is determining are you in or out of this area, and is that was confusing a lot of people. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Murray. Next question over to Kurt.
Yeah, just to follow up on that question. So Upper Carmi is a fairly close-knit community, and we have a residence list with contact information. And so I would say I fielded, I don't know, 10 to 12 phone calls from local residents expressing their frustration with the complexity of the survey and asking for clarity on certain points. So just for a point of reference, yeah, I got at least 10 phone calls from locals saying this is a little bit confusing. That's all I have to say.
Okay. And not to leave that all with the consultants by any stretch of the imagination, because the committee reviewed this several times in an effort to try to get the questions asked and get the desired feedback. Okay, other questions from anybody? Okay.
Not a question, but maybe just a comment. I know a couple meetings ago, Ron was raising a point about are you taking advantage of a communications expert or person? And I don't know really where that went, but I kind of feel having somebody who's skilled at putting surveys together and communicating and soliciting high responses, that might have been an asset they could have provided you. I don't know if that's where Ron was coming from with that, or maybe just part of it, but no. So just a comment.
Okay. Other comments related to the survey?
Matt, I have two more
Judy?
questions, and I promise that's the end of them. Sherry, just to confirm based on Murray's question, there wasn't a match between how people said, do you live in this this area versus where they said they lived in question one. The numbers weren't internally consistent. So when you ranked it, I think it's in Appendix 3, when you noted how people in Okanagan Falls ranked the different options, did you use the question one criteria, or did you use the question two, do you live in this area question? Does that make sense?
Yeah. All of the rankings on where people live is where they identified in question one.
Okay, that's great.
Always,
because,
yeah.
Yeah, because there were some strange answers in question two, where what area people thought they lived in. And my last question is that when you were discussing the Sorrento Bay study with the committee, I think you said that the population reaching that 5,000 mark was became a major factor in people saying no to the referendum. Was that right? And then if that's the case, is there any concerns with that in this case, how close we are to that 5,000 mark, depending on how large the area is? Is that something that the committee perhaps should be thinking about or not?
Maybe I can answer that, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Judy, for the question. Yeah, in the Sorrento Blind Bay exercise, yes. In fact, by the time the vote was called and by the time electors went to go cast their votes, the population had already exceeded that 5,000. So it was very clear that the area within that was constituted of as the study area, that is the boundary that was chosen, that population within that boundary was above that 5,000 trigger. And so that municipality, had it been created, would be responsible 5 years later for policing costs. In the Area D, Okanagan Falls and other neighborhoods that make up Area D, there's no, and I think we made this point early on, but there's been so much information that it's understandable that it got looked over, but there's no combination of areas we could put together that would come close to that 5,000 at this point. So for the time being, at least, that 5,000 is far enough away. If that weren't the case, if we were kind of pressing up, I guess, in certain options against that would be something that the committee might want to consider, and it certainly would become an issue in the incorporation study.
Be getting close in 2 or 3 years?
I don't, Sherry, can you maybe comment just on terms of what the population is
Current
now?
population for option D and E.
4,016 is the total population for Area D.
So there's quite a bit of runway there, as it were.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I think this is our last call for questions. Okay. Ron, I'm going to invite you if you'd like to make any comments before we close.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would. Some quick ones, and these are just in random order, but I've been listening a lot, obviously. To Judy's question about McLean Creek Road, how many people live there? We know there's 30 titles. We know that average titles are going to have more than 2 people, so you can throw that up to over 60. But I can tell you, I know people who live in that area, the Thomas family. They've been there forever. The McLean family, others have been there a long time. They care intimately about this study. We've heard from Kelvin Hall, who was the chair of our Parks and Rec Commission, speak to this committee, and he expressed his concerns, I think, in public meetings, so we all heard them. But I can tell you that there are properties there that I'm aware of where you've got more than one family. You'll have the, the mom and dad on the property, but maybe a daughter married to and they've got multiple buildings. And I know a few like that. So that bumps it up a little above average. It's not like every property has one apartment with one person living in it, for example, like you might have in OK Falls in an apartment building. We have apartment buildings in OK Falls, which might have only one occupant. McLean Creek Road's not that kind of community. I think the response from those areas, the edges and the fringes, as consultants have referred to them, if you look at the responses, they have spoken up pretty loudly and expressed their interest in participating. I think we see that in the data, and I'm looking forward to hearing more. I don't see the PowerPoint that Sherry shared with us early on. Some of that breakdown I found fascinating. I tried to take some screenshots with my phone, but I was going to ask if I missed it in the 73 pages. That's on me. But if that kind of data can be provided to us all, I think it's very useful and much appreciated. I've had a lot of feedback. Kurt mentioned his experience in Upper Carmi. I have a coffee meeting with the director, for example, this past Monday, and the community gives me feedback. And one lady, incredibly polite, quite elderly, and she said to me very nicely, she talked about the survey deadline had passed. She asked me if I knew what the results were, but she also said to me, she said, do you want to know what people are telling me, what people are saying? And what a lovely way to ask, right? Do you want to know? And I said, sure. What are they saying? She said, lots of people are saying it's hard to understand. And that's sort of what Kurt was saying. And I think that's valuable feedback for this committee, and I think Matt's right. The committee worked hard with the consultants on those questions and on the effort. And yet I hear back that it was hard to understand. I heard back more than that, in fact, from various communities, not just one. I was invited to many communities. I get invited to different meetings. I get to listen. I was at another meeting and I meet people all the time. And this was over north of the Trestle Bridge. And there's a gentleman who lives there. He's 78. He's going to jump off the Trestle Bridge. He's wrote the book on Skaha Bluffs rock climbing. He helped get that provincial park done. And he thanked me because he saw me on the news and he heard what I said about the festival and he thanked me. And his wife said to him, said to me, he wrote the book, And I said, really? Because I had a question from a CBC program producer the day before asking if I knew anybody, and it just coincided. And he's a biologist, and they have, he's birds, and this man's amazing. I'm sure Mr. Taylor knows who I'm speaking of. And the wife, she tells me her family owned that land 100 years ago, and they live there now. And she asked me a question. She was aware of the survey. She said, who decided that we're not part of OK Falls? What a neat question. Who decided? I said, well, I give her the full answer, of course, but I'm at other meetings. And as I'm at these meetings, what I hear, the feedback I get is a hunger. People want information. They really appreciate the information. They're not all getting the information. This is an excellent beginning. This process is wonderful, but I find the feedback and the response really interesting. But I also know that there are people who are not yet fully understanding all the information. I know that because they tell me. That's how I know. And when I give feedback back to this committee, I believe I have a duty. When I hear from community, it's my obligation as the representative for this community to give that information back to the committee. This is what they tell me. I think they expect me to share it with all of you. And if I don't do that, I feel remiss. I feel I've done something wrong. So I like to share what I hear. I like to give you all the benefit of it. I had one gentleman in OK Falls, very elderly, very experienced, lived there a long time, very enthusiastic, again, earlier this week. And he said he was excited. He told me he sent in his survey and he was proud. And he told me, and he starts to tell me, he says, you know, I picked the smallest boundary because that's how you keep the taxes the lowest. I said, really? How do you know that? And I talked to him about how the taxes are done and some of the facts, just the facts. And he said to me, and it was almost painful to watch, he said, oh no, I didn't understand that. I didn't understand. I didn't. And he had regret. Now, I let him know not to worry. You know, this is, you know, it'll all get sorted out. But it demonstrates the hunger, the interest, the community concern, and it's so good that we're going through this process. It's so good that well, it's so good when we have staff and consultants, staff from the province listening and helping out. It's so good. It's so appreciated. So I want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you for permitting me to speak. And I look forward to hearing more. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kurt.
Yeah, so my community asked me, they said the same thing. There's a lot of complexity to this. We don't understand everything. You've been to the meetings, you've been paying attention. Do you mind just giving us a short synopsis of what your observations were? And so I put together, it was much longer than I had hoped, a 34-minute YouTube video and linked it to our community association. Before that, I was on our community Facebook page and saying, please participate, please. And nobody was interested. Nobody, just nothing happened. As soon as I posted that 34-minute video, the phones lit up, the questions, the comments, how many people had seen that video in my community skyrocketed within 2 days. And I can possibly attribute that to the contribution of Upper Carmi, is that they got some information, they digested it, and they acted upon it, where we didn't have information that easily accessible by other means. Yeah, there was Skaha Matters and there was some other ways, but in today's world, everybody wants fast food. And so if they can click on one button and hear somebody give them the abridged version, then they immediately have something to talk about or digest. And so maybe moving forward, we could think about answering some of these questions en masse via little blog posts or video blog posts, you know, that that may be a more effective way of communicating. In my community, it worked fantastic.
Okay. I would see that being more for the next phase if we get there, but I heard David said when we get there, so I'm sure we'll get there. Okay, thanks, Kurt. Any other comments before we adjourn? Ron, you're waving your hand to ask a question or to say goodbye?
Well, I was raising my hand and I wasn't getting recognized, so I waved it after I didn't get recognized, so you'd see me, and thank you for recognizing me. I appreciate it. And it is a comment arising. Very briefly, there was a question about communications, and I'm not sure if it was Murray or somebody else, but the short answer to his question is, in part, yes, that was what I had in mind. And again, I've had community input on this issue of communications. I've spoken with others at LGLA and at SILGA, many, in fact, other communities, others who've been through the process. And Kurt's comments reminded me, and indeed, I contacted, before this committee was struck, I expressed concern about communications to the chair, as he now is. and to staff. Christy Malden will remember I spoke to this, and I spoke to other staff as well. And when we had our report out on April 13, I called, and community members didn't have the information. The idea of a communications consultant is to complement this process. I care that it's fair. That's what I care about. And to me, fair process means, and I spoke to David Van Omen about this when I first met him on a Zoom meeting about April last year. I care that it's fair. I care that the community and information communication, it's a multi-lane highway. It's not a one-way street. It's not we have a web page, go look at it. And I remember Alan spoke to this in the very first meeting. He said, people receive information differently. We need to get information out differently to different people. We've had members in community thank me because they don't have good computer connection, and they really appreciate coming in person. So the people who've brought concern to me about communications, which I've repeated to this committee's benefit, those concerns were brought to me by community members, some of whom have experience. And I've spoken with others who are expert in the area. Jan Ans, I met with her, it's LGLA, and Chris Field were people I spoke to specific to the purpose, and I spoke with others. So moving forward, we can't undo what we have been through, that's true, but we can sure learn a lot from this feedback. We can learn if we're listening, if we're open-minded to hearing what others say, which I think we should be, and I like to think we are. When we learn, when we listen, when we understand that there's a hunger for this information, and we can, that's what matters. Good information, give people the facts, tell them the differences, give them the information, let them know. They're hungry to know. And we have really, 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 really intelligent people in Area D. They ask great questions. They want to know. They want to know. And when we do the job and give them good communication, give them good information, I think we can trust them. They'll make decisions. That's what this is about. Let them make the decisions. And we are not there yet. But this committee has a job to do. And I think you just want to keep that in mind. You want to be open-minded. You want to be, mosquitoes are getting me. So I think that's my cue to say good night, and thank you very much to everybody. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. The point is noted. It's easy to say you can always communicate better. Some specific examples were suggested. I'm sure that in a final report, we can make suggestions about what might be done in the next phase. And that will perhaps contribute to a more effective study. And, everybody's always trying to do a good work. So sure, this is good stuff. We'll try to capture that and build that into the next phase. Now, I'm going to just quickly, we've heard from our public, we've heard from the director, we've heard from the consultants. I just want to remind our committee that you will be receiving material in all likelihood from Sherry and Alan on Friday, I think, plus or minus 12:01. And our next meeting is Tuesday night, 6 p.m. Again, the job is to receive the final review of the survey data, review the report that's been provided, and provide a recommendation to proceed or not with an incorporation study and a specific area. And clearly, we're going to have to get through some of that first stuff relatively in a timely manner, while still allowing time for questions, in order to provide time for suitable recommendation as to what, and discussion as to what that boundary is going to be. That's going to be a challenge, folks. Okay, a good one. We're up to it. So with those comments, I think I'll take a motion to adjourn? Kurt, thank you. Can I have a seconder, please? David Forst. All right. Thank you very much, folks.